In the autumn of 1632, a carriage arrives at the gates of Fürstenberg, a minor principality in the war-torn Holy Roman Empire. Inside sits a man who calls himself Paracelsus the Younger. He carries no gold. He carries no army. He carries only a leather-bound manuscript and a promise. Within 6 months, this man will control half the principality's treasury. Within a year, he will have convinced desperate nobility to invest their family fortunes in smoke and mirrors. Within 18 months, the principality will cease to exist. You've been told that alchemy was mysticism, that it was superstition, that educated people dismissed it as fraud. But that's not the story. In the 17th century, alchemy was chemistry. It was metallurgy. It was pharmacy. The line between legitimate science and fraud wasn't clear because science itself wasn't clear. And when desperate men need miracles, they stop asking questions. You've heard of Ponzi schemes, of financial fraud, of investors losing everything to con artists. But what if I told you that the first modern financial scam wasn't about stocks or bonds? What if the prototype for every investment fraud that followed happened 400 years ago in a war-ravaged German castle, with the Alchemist crucible instead of a hedge fund? The mechanism that destroyed Fürstenberg wasn't magic. It was mathematics. It was the same mathematics that would later destroy banks, nations, and empires. The same pattern of desperate borrowing, impossible promises, and inevitable collapse. The alchemist understood something profound. You don't need to create gold. You only need to create belief in gold. In the next 20 minutes, you'll see exactly how this system worked. You'll understand why intelligent people invested in an obvious fraud. You'll see how financial desperation creates its own logic, its own momentum, its own inevitability. And most importantly, you'll recognize this pattern because it's still operating today in forms you probably haven't noticed. The year 1618 marks the beginning of what historians would later call the 30 Years' War. Though to those living through it, it felt less like a single war and more like civilization eating itself. The Holy Roman Empire, that patchwork of kingdoms, principalities, bishoprics, and free cities, tears itself apart over religion, over power, over territory, over everything. By 1630, Central Europe is unrecognizable. Swedish armies march through Brandenburg. Spanish troops occupy the Rhineland. French gold flows to Protestant princes. Catholic Bavaria expands at the expense of its neighbors. And everywhere, always, the mercenaries, the real power in this war. Armies of professional soldiers who fight for whoever pays them, and who plunder everyone when payment stops. The economic model of warfare has fundamentally changed. Medieval kings called upon feudal levies, nobles who owed military service. But those armies were small, seasonal, and unreliable. The new model requires professional soldiers, trained troops, permanent armies. And professional soldiers require one thing above all: cash. Regular cash. Enormous amounts of cash. The small German principalities, caught in the middle of this continental war, face an impossible situation. They need armies to defend themselves. Armies require gold, but their territories are devastated. Crops burned, villages emptied, tax revenues collapsed. They need to pay 20,000 Reichstaler per month to maintain a minimal defensive force. They collect perhaps 5,000. Enter the financial innovators. Across Europe, a new class of operators emerges. Financial contractors who promise to raise money for desperate rulers. They sell offices, titles, monopolies, tax collection rights. They charge enormous fees, 15 to 20% of everything they raise. But for princes drowning in debt, 20% of something beats 100% of nothing. Prince Friedrich III of Fürstenberg is one of these desperate rulers. His principality, once prosperous, has been trampled by Swedish and imperial armies. His treasury is empty. His credit is exhausted. His subjects are starving. He has already sold every office he can create, mortgaged every estate he owns, debased his currency twice. And still the mercenaries demand payment. Friedrich isn't stupid. He's educated, trained in law at Vienna, fluent in Latin, versed in natural philosophy. He knows the empire's history, its power structures, its fatal weaknesses. He looks around and sees other princes solving the problem through military entrepreneurship. Wallenstein, a minor Czech nobleman, has made himself the second richest man in the empire by raising private armies and extracting wealth from conquered territories. But Friedrich doesn't have Wallenstein's resources. He doesn't have vast Bohemian estates to mortgage. He doesn't have a wealthy widow's fortune to invest. He doesn't have connections to the great banking houses of Augsburg or Nuremberg. What he has is 6,000 subjects, rapidly diminishing credibility, and a recruitment problem. He needs 12,000 gulden to hire even a small mercenary force. This is the world into which Paracelsus the Younger arrives. A world where impossible problems create market opportunities for impossible solutions. Where desperate rulers will listen to anyone offering hope. Where the line between legitimate financial innovation and outright fraud has become invisible. The timing is perfect. Belief in alchemy remains strong among the educated classes. Legitimate chemists and pharmacists call themselves alchemists. The Habsburg emperors maintain alchemical laboratories in Prague. The transformation of base metal into gold, transmutation, seems plausible because matter itself isn't yet understood. If wood becomes ash, if water becomes ice, why shouldn't lead become gold? Friedrich has heard the stories. Alchemists at various German courts promising gold, receiving funding, delivering nothing. Some executed as frauds, dragged through streets, mutilated with hot pincers, hanged on gilded gallows. Others simply disappearing in the night with whatever they could steal. But Friedrich also knows the other story. The story of what happens to princes who can't pay their armies. Mutiny, plunder, conquest, the end of the dynasty. When your choice is between possible fraud and certain destruction, fraud starts looking reasonable. Paracelsus the Younger doesn't arrive in Fürstenberg claiming to make gold tomorrow. That's amateur fraud, the kind that gets you hanged. He arrives with a more sophisticated proposition, a business plan. The meeting takes place in Friedrich's private chambers, late autumn 1632. Paracelsus spreads his manuscript across the table. Detailed drawings of laboratory equipment, citations from Albertus Magnus and Roger Bacon, chemical formulas in encrypted notation. His pitch is elegant in its complexity. The philosopher's stone exists. Paracelsus has the formula. But the formula requires specific conditions, specialized equipment, rare materials, precise temperature control. The transformation cannot be rushed. The great work requires 3 stages, each taking months. Nigredo, blackening, albedo, whitening, rubedo, reddening. Only after completing all 3 stages can base metal be transformed into gold. Here's the genius of the pitch. Paracelsus doesn't ask for payment. He proposes a partnership. Friedrich will finance construction of a laboratory and purchase of materials. In exchange, Paracelsus will share the formula and the profits. 50-50 split of all gold produced. But there's a problem. The laboratory requires immediate funding. 6,000 gulden for construction, another 4,000 for equipment and materials. Friedrich doesn't have 10,000 gulden. His treasury is empty. This is where Paracelsus reveals his true innovation. He proposes that Friedrich issue golden certificates. These certificates are promises. Holders can exchange them for gold once the transmutation succeeds. The certificates can be sold immediately to raise construction funds. The logic seems sound. Friedrich's subjects and neighboring merchants will purchase these certificates at a discount. For example, a certificate promising 100 gulden worth of gold, sold today for 70 gulden cash. The buyers profit if transmutation succeeds. Friedrich gets immediate cash to build the laboratory. Everyone wins if the alchemy works. Friedrich hesitatis. He asks the obvious question, what if it doesn't work? Paracelsus has an answer. He proposes a demonstration. Give him 3 months and a small budget. If he cannot demonstrate the first stage of transmutation, Friedrich can expel him. No golden certificates, no risk. In January 1633, Paracelsus performs his demonstration. The details are theatrical. A small crucible, lead and mercury mixed with mysterious powders. Intense heat for 6 hours. When the crucible cools, a small quantity of silver appears. Not gold yet. That requires the full 3 stages but visible transformation of base metal into precious metal. The trick, of course, is simple. The mysterious powders contain dissolved silver. The heat process merely precipitates it. But Friedrich doesn't know this. His court physician, a man trained in Galenic medicine but not metallurgy, examines the result and confirms. The sample contains silver. Friedrich makes his decision. In February 1633, he announces the issuance of 30,000 gulden in golden certificates. The certificates promise exchange for gold at face value once the great work completes. Estimated completion. Autumn 1633, 9 months away. The first issuance sells out within weeks. Not to foreign investors or sophisticated bankers, but to local merchants, guild masters, and minor nobility. People who know Friedrich, who live in Fürstenberg, who can walk to the construction site and watch the laboratory being built. Why do they buy? Because the mathematics of desperation creates its own logic. The war has destroyed normal investment opportunities. Trade routes are closed. Agriculture is disrupted. Banking is paralyzed. Cash holdings lose value through currency debasement. But golden certificates offer a specific return at a specific date. And unlike other wartime schemes, this one is backed by science. The laboratory construction proceeds through spring 1633. Paracelsus supervises every detail. Stone furnaces capable of extreme heat. Ventilation systems to remove toxic fumes. Storage for rare materials. Mercury, antimony, sal ammoniac. The spending is extravagant but visible. Every gulden spent on construction is a gulden that Friedrich can point to as evidence of seriousness. In May 1633, Friedrich issues a second series of certificates, another 20,000 gulden. The justification: Paracelsus has discovered that larger-scale transmutation requires additional equipment. The formula works, but scaling from demonstration to production requires exponentially more investment. This second issuance also sells faster than the first. Word has spread beyond Fürstenberg. Merchants in neighboring principalities, hearing about the project, send representatives to inquire. Some purchase certificates. Others propose joint ventures. A syndicate of Nuremberg merchants offers to purchase the entire next issuance at 80% of face value. Now the machine begins to accelerate. Friedrich discovers that he can use golden certificates not just to raise cash, but as a currency. He pays suppliers in certificates. He compensates officials with certificates. He even begins recruiting mercenaries by offering payment in certificates. At a discount, naturally, but desperate soldiers accept desperate payment. The economic effect is remarkable. Fürstenberg's economy, moribund for years, suddenly shows activity. Suppliers arrive to sell materials to the laboratory. Workers are hired for construction. Merchants reopen shops to serve the influx of workers and visitors. The Principality experiences something resembling prosperity. But underneath this apparent success, a more sinister dynamic is emerging. Friedrich has now issued 70,000 gulden in golden certificates, 7 times his annual tax revenue. The certificates promise exchange for gold, but the laboratory hasn't produced a single gram. The entire economy now depends on Paracelsus delivering on his promise. By summer 1633, the deadline for the first transmutation approaches. Certificate holders begin asking questions. Will they see results? How much gold will the first batch produce? Can they visit the laboratory and observe the process? Paracelsus has answers. The great work cannot be observed during critical phases. The presence of skeptics can disrupt the subtle essences. The first batch will be small, perhaps 5,000 gulden worth of gold, but it will prove the principle. Once the process is validated, scaling to industrial production will be straightforward. In August 1633, Paracelsus announces a delay. The rubedo stage has encountered complications. The mercury must be purified to a higher degree than initially estimated. This requires additional materials, additional time, and, inevitably, additional funding. Friedrich faces his first serious crisis of credibility. Certificate holders are growing restless. Some demand refunds, but Friedrich cannot provide refunds. The money has been spent on a laboratory. His only option is to push forward. He issues a third series of certificates, but this time the terms change. The new certificates offer a premium, 120 gulden of gold for every 100 gulden invested. The premium is necessary because confidence is eroding. Investors need greater inducement to participate. What Friedrich doesn't fully grasp yet, he's now operating a Ponzi scheme. He's using new investments to maintain operations that produce no actual value, while promising ever larger returns that require even more investment to sustain. The mathematics have become self-reinforcing and self-destructing simultaneously. September 1633 brings two developments that shatter the illusion. The first, Swedish armies, advancing through Swabia, approach Fürstenberg borders. They demand protection payments, 20,000 Reichstaler immediately, or face plunder. Friedrich doesn't have 20,000 Reichstaler. He offers golden certificates. The Swedish commander laughs and gives Friedrich 1 week. The second development is more subtle but more devastating. Landgrave Wilhelm of Hesse-Kassel, a neighboring prince, sends his court mathematician to investigate the alchemical project. Not out of hostility, but out of interest, Wilhelm is considering a similar scheme for his own territories. The mathematician, a Jesuit named Father Kircher, arrives with credentials and curiosity. He asks to observe the transmutation process. Paracelsus refuses, citing the sanctity of the great work. Kircher persists. He requests samples of the materials being used. He asks specific technical questions about temperature, timing, and reagent ratios. Paracelsus stonewalls, but his evasions reveal everything to an expert observer. Kircher examines the laboratory's purchasing records, obtained from local suppliers. The quantities of mercury and antimony are far too small for the scale of transmutation claimed. Worse, the laboratory has purchased large quantities of gold leaf, supposedly for experimental controls, but suspiciously timed with demonstration dates. Kircher's report to Wilhelm is damning. In technical language, he explains that the chemistry doesn't work. The temperatures claimed are insufficient for atomic restructuring. The processes described violate basic principles of matter. And most tellingly, the purchasing patterns suggest Paracelsus is simply melting pre-purchased gold and presenting it as transmuted product. Wilhelm shares Kircher's report with Friedrich as a courtesy between princes. The report arrives on September 12, 1633. Friedrich reads it in his chambers, alone. For the first time, he must confront the possibility, the likelihood, that he has built his entire financial recovery on fraud. But confronting the fraud creates an impossible dilemma. If Friedrich exposes Paracelsus, the golden certificates become worthless. Certificate holders will riot. Friedrich's credibility will be destroyed, and the Swedish army is still coming. Friedrich makes a calculation. If Paracelsus is a fraud, exposing him now accomplishes nothing except accelerating the collapse. But if the fraud can be maintained for a few more months, perhaps Friedrich can find alternative solutions, negotiate with Sweden, raise conventional loans, restructure the debt. So Friedrich does something remarkable. He becomes complicit in his own deception. He meets with Paracelsus in secret. He shows him Kircher's report, and he makes a proposal. Stage one more successful demonstration, produce enough gold to satisfy the immediate crisis, and then, after this emergency passes, they can address the underlying problems. Paracelsus agrees, not because he has any loyalty to Friedrich, but because staying gives him access to what remains in the treasury. He has perhaps 6 weeks before the situation becomes untenable. 6 weeks to extract maximum value before disappearing. On September 20th, 1633, Paracelsus announces success. The great work has reached completion. The first transmutation will be demonstrated publicly in 3 days. All certificate holders are invited to witness. The demonstration is scheduled for the castle courtyard. Hundreds attend, certificate holders, merchants, officials, neighboring nobility. Paracelsus appears in elaborate robes. The furnace has been prepared. The ceremony takes 6 hours. When the crucible finally opens, it contains gold. Not the 70,000 gulden promised by the certificates. Perhaps 3,000 gulden worth. But gold, visible and real. The crowd reacts with joy. Not because 3,000 is sufficient. Everyone understands it's not. But because it proves the principle. The alchemy works. The certificates have value. The investment will pay off. Only a few people know the truth. Friedrich knows the gold was purchased last week from a Nuremberg merchant. Paracelsus knows, obviously. And Father Kircher, watching from the crowd incognito, knows. But knowing the truth doesn't change the immediate dynamic. The demonstration accomplishes its purpose. Certificate prices stabilize. Friedrich successfully negotiates a reduced contribution with Sweden, paying in a mix of cash, certificates, and promises. The crisis passes. For exactly 3 weeks. October 1633 reveals the sophisticated trap into which Friedrich has fallen. The mercenary captain Friedrich hired in June, a professional named Wallman, has done the mathematics. His troops haven't been paid in full for 3 months. They've received partial payment in golden certificates, which they initially accepted. But certificates cannot buy food. They cannot purchase ammunition. And now merchants are refusing to accept them at face value. Wallmann confronts Friedrich. He requires 12,000 Reichstaler in coin immediately. Not certificates, not promises, coin. Friedrich doesn't have 12,000 Reichstaler. The September demonstration consumed his last cash reserves. Wallman delivers an ultimatum. Payment in full within 2 weeks, or his troops will extract payment by plundering Fürstenberg. This is standard practice. Mercenaries operating in territory without compensation simply take what they're owed. Legally, morally, practically, Friedrich's non-payment releases Wallman from his contract. Friedrich attempts one more certificate issuance. This time, no one buys. The market has figured out what Friedrich and Paracelsus have known for weeks. The certificates are worthless. They represent claims on gold that doesn't exist and cannot be produced. On October 22nd, 1633, an explosion destroys the alchemical laboratory. The blast kills 2 workers and ignites a fire that burns for 3 days. When investigators sift through the rubble, they find no gold, no equipment still functional, no materials that suggest transmutation was ever possible. And Paracelsus has vanished. Not immediately after the explosion. That would be too obvious. He disappears 2 days later, during the chaos of fighting the fires and searching the rubble. He takes with him approximately 4,000 gulden from the treasury, everything that remained. The explosion was deliberate, of course. Paracelsus staged it as his exit strategy. The fire destroys evidence. The deaths create sympathy and distraction. And the disaster provides Friedrich with an excuse. The great work was real, but fate intervened. Friedrich tries to maintain this narrative. He issues proclamations. The laboratory will be rebuilt. The transmutation will resume. Certificate holders will eventually receive their gold. No one believes him. By November, certificate holders riot in the capital. They demand refunds Friedrich cannot provide. Some propose seizing Friedrich's personal property. Others suggest petitioning the emperor for intervention. Wallman solves the problem in the most direct way possible. On November 15th, 1633, his mercenaries begin systematically plundering Fürstenberg. They take crops, livestock, tools, furniture, anything with value. They occupy the richest estates. They effectively convert Friedrich's territory into a resource base for Wallmann's continued operations. Friedrich appeals to Emperor Ferdinand for help, but Ferdinand has no resources to spare. The war continues across the empire. Ferdinand's own finances are precarious. And besides, Friedrich's problems are self-inflicted. He made a bad bet on an obvious fraud. Imperial intervention would simply be throwing good money after bad. In December 1633, a delegation from Hesse-Kassel arrives with a proposal. Landgrave Wilhelm offers to assume Friedrich's debts, the unpaid mercenaries, the Swedish contribution, everything. In exchange, Friedrich will cede sovereignty over Fürstenberg. The Principality will become a protected territory of Hesse-Kassel. Friedrich has no choice. He signs the agreement on December 28, 1633. The Fürstenberg dynasty, which has ruled the territory for 200 years, effectively ends. Friedrich retains a ceremonial title and a small pension. But real power now belongs to Wilhelm. This is the sophisticated control mechanism that emerges from the rubble. Wilhelm hasn't conquered Fürstenberg militarily. He hasn't invaded with armies. He hasn't even demanded territory through treaty. Instead, he's acquired control through debt assumption. The mechanism works like this. Wilhelm pays off Friedrich's mercenaries 12,000 Reichstaler. He satisfies the Swedish contribution, 20,000 Reichstaler. He compensates the most politically important certificate holders at 10% of face value, another 15,000 Reichstaler. Total cost, 47,000 Reichstaler. In exchange, Wilhelm gains control of Fürstenberg's tax revenues. He installs his own officials. He reorganizes the administration. He integrates Fürstenberg's economy into Hesse-Kassel's system. The beauty of the mechanism, it's voluntary. Friedrich isn't conquered, he's rescued. The transfer of sovereignty is legal, documented, witnessed. Friedrich even thanks Wilhelm publicly for his generosity. But the effect is identical to military conquest. Fürstenberg loses independence. Its people now serve foreign interests. Its resources are extracted for Wilhelm's benefit. And it all happens through financial engineering, not warfare. Was the Fürstenberg debt trap unique? No. It was a local expression of a pattern that would repeat across centuries and continents. 30 years later, in the 1660s, England's Charles II faces a similar crisis. He needs money to fight the Dutch. He issues government bonds backed by future tax revenues. When he cannot repay, he declares a stop of the exchequer, a partial default. Bondholders who trusted the crown lose fortunes. The pattern, desperate borrowing, impossible promises, inevitable collapse. In the 18th century, France's repeated financial crises follow the same template. The monarchy issues ever more creative financial instruments to fund endless wars. The infamous traitants, financial contractors who sell these instruments for commission, make fortunes while the state slides toward bankruptcy. By 1789, debt service consumes half the royal budget. The pattern accelerates into revolution. But perhaps the closest parallel appears in the 19th century with the Ottoman debt trap. The Ottoman Empire, desperate to modernize and fund defense, borrows from European banks. The terms are predatory from the start. For every 100 borrowed, they receive 80 in cash but owe interest on the full 100. When they cannot repay, European bankers create the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, a foreign-controlled agency that collects the empire's most valuable tax revenues and sends them to London and Paris. Sovereignty erodes not through conquest, but through debt. Why does this pattern repeat? First, information asymmetry. In Friedrich's case, he knew less about alchemy than Paracelsus claimed to know. In the Ottoman case, the empire's officials knew less about international finance than European bankers. Desperation makes people accept deals they don't fully understand. Second, time preference distortion. When you face immediate existential threats, Swedish armies at the border, mercenaries demanding payment, future costs become abstract. Friedrich needed 12,000 gulden, immediately more than he feared 70,000 gulden in future obligations. This isn't irrational stupidity. It's rational short-term thinking in an environment where long-term planning feels like luxury. Third, the absence of bankruptcy mechanisms. Modern states can declare bankruptcy and restructure debt under legal frameworks. In the 17th century, no such mechanisms existed for principalities. Friedrich's only options were pay, default completely, or lose sovereignty. There was no middle ground, no negotiated restructuring. Fourth, the logic of extraction. Once Wilhelm acquires control of Fürstenberg through debt assumption, he doesn't just recover his 47,000 Reichstaler. He gains permanent access to Fürstenberg's tax revenues, trade routes, and resources. The rescue is actually an investment that pays returns indefinitely. This same logic drives modern financial imperialism. Consider contemporary developing nations. They borrow from international institutions to build infrastructure, develop resources, modernize economies. The debt seems manageable because economic growth is projected. But when growth disappoints, due to commodity price crashes, climate disasters, or global financial crises, the debt becomes unpayable. What follows is the modern equivalent of Wilhelm's intervention. The International Monetary Fund arrives with rescue packages. They restructure the debt. But in exchange, they require structural adjustment, privatization of state assets, elimination of subsidies, opening of markets to foreign investment. Sovereignty erodes through financial pressure. Or consider the 2008 financial crisis and its European aftermath. Greece borrowed heavily to finance government spending. When the debt became unpayable, European institutions provided bailouts. But those bailouts came with conditions: austerity measures, pension cuts, asset sales. Greek parliament votes on budgets approved in Brussels. The mechanism is more sophisticated than Wilhelm's seizure of Fürstenberg, but the principle is identical. Even a specific fraud, Paracelsus's alchemical scheme, has modern equivalents. Cryptocurrency projects promising revolutionary returns backed by complex technology most investors don't understand. Special purpose acquisition companies raising capital based on promises of future business transformations. Any financial instrument that separates investment from payoff by a period of time in a veil of complexity creates opportunities for Paracelsus-style fraud. The fundamental pattern persists. Desperate entities need capital. Capital providers charge premiums for risk. But those premiums can themselves create the conditions for default. Once default occurs, capital providers acquire control. What begins as lending ends as ownership. This isn't conspiracy. It's system design. Individual actors, Friedrich, Paracelsus, Wilhelm, the certificate holders, all behave rationally within their constraints. Friedrich wasn't stupid to try the alchemical solution. Paracelsus wasn't uniquely evil to exploit the opportunity. Wilhelm wasn't malicious to acquire Fürstenberg through debt. All of them were responding to incentives created by war, scarcity, and institutional weakness. But rational individual decisions aggregate into systemic pathologies. The same pathologies that destroyed Fürstenberg operate today in countries you've never heard of. Small nations trapped in debt to large institutions, unable to invest in education or infrastructure because all surplus goes to debt service, slowly hollowing out while maintaining the appearance of sovereignty. The story of Fürstenberg ends in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia. That treaty concludes the 30 Years' War and redraws the map of Central Europe. Fürstenberg no longer exists as an independent entity. It's been fully absorbed into Hesse-Castle's territory. The absorption is recognized in the treaty as legal and permanent. Friedrich III dies in 1651, age 47. The official cause is fever, but contemporary accounts suggest something darker. A man broken by failure, by humiliation, by the knowledge that his desperation destroyed his dynasty. His son inherits the ceremonial title, but nothing else. The family fades into obscurity. And Paracelsus the Younger? He surfaces 6 months later in Bavaria under a different name. He approaches Duke Maximilian with a proposal for transmuting mercury into silver. The Duke is initially interested, but word reaches Munich from Hesse Castle about the Fürstenberg disaster. Paracelsus is arrested, interrogated, and executed in 1635. His body is hung on a gilded gallows as warning to other frauds. The golden certificates themselves survive as historical artifacts. Some are held in German archives today, beautifully printed documents promising gold that never existed. They're reminders that financial instruments are only worth what someone will pay for them. In an environment of desperation, people will pay for hope itself. The broader lesson isn't about alchemy or medieval fraud. It's about power and its modern expressions. In the 17th century, conquest required armies. Occupation required troops. Control was visible, foreign soldiers in your streets, foreign flags on your buildings. But financial conquest is cheaper and less visible. You don't need soldiers if you control the debt. You don't need occupation if you control the revenue streams. Sovereignty becomes abstract when someone else decides your budget. The Fürstenberg story is a template still in use. Desperate borrowing enabled by sophisticated financial instruments. Promises of future prosperity that justify present sacrifice. And when the promises fail, the quiet transfer of control from debtor to creditor. This is how empires operate in the modern world. Not through invasion, but through investment. Not through conquest, but through credit. The mechanisms are more sophisticated than Wilhelm's seizure of Fürstenberg, but the mathematics remain identical. If Friedrich's story teaches us anything, it's this: pay attention when desperate entities make impossible promises. Ask who benefits from the desperation. Follow the money not just forward. What will this promise deliver? But backward. Who is providing the capital and what do they ultimately want? Because the pattern is old. The script is well written. And somewhere, right now, another Friedrich is sitting in another castle, looking at another impossible problem. And another Paracelsus is arriving with another leather-bound manuscript and another promise. And the mechanism will run its course again. Because desperation always creates markets. And markets always create Paracelsuses.